I'm Giacomo Pagot from University of Padova, and on the behalf also of my colleagues and professors, Elena Pisani and Paola Gatto, I'm presenting the work that we did within an Italian project coordinated by Professor Bassi. So this was about trying to understand a bit about the immaterial commons. So this traditional, this body of knowledge that is actually a common owned by communities in the mountains, in this case. Okay. So, we know that, for example, in the case of ecosystem services from the mountains to the plain areas, there are some issues ongoing, mostly related, for example, to climate change and demographic decline that impacts the people managing the ecosystems that are in the mountains and affecting, therefore, the ecosystem services provision. However, there are some interesting examples of sustainable models and resilient models for keeping an active presence, an active human presence in harsh environments, such as might be the mountains. And this is the case most often of common land organizations. There are many called with many different names. We have seen the French cases and some others. In Italy, there are as well. And the thing that we wanted to understand a bit with this work was related to the fact that we hear a lot of talks about indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge, most often researched and worked with in the global south, for example, or in South America or Southeast Asia. But there is very little knowledge about it in Europe, for example, where like a formal system of education in most cases overcame the traditional ones, the informal knowledge. So we wanted to understand a bit if there is still some kind of body of knowledge that might be called the traditional ecological knowledge in our case study, in this case. And at the same time, we are aware that this, if there is still some of this traditional ecological knowledge, we are aware that it might be challenged by the fact that people are disappearing from mountain areas, and therefore also the knowledge that they have, it's disappearing as well. So this was our approach. So we did the first part of qualitative work with some interviews and some literature review to understand which are the pieces of knowledge that could still be considered and existing in the area. And then we switched to a more quantitative approach with a survey at community level, for which we have to thank a lot with the cooperation of the Comunanze. They supported us a lot in this, so thanks. For which we had almost a 20% response rate of the households in the area. So, some results. Here we are talking, sorry, the font is super small, but here there is a list of the traditional practices that we managed to identify. For example, the tree felling for personal use, mostly for fuel wood production, hunting, some collection of non-wood forest products, collection of wild herbs to sell. So we have seen that most of these practices are scarcely still actively done in the area. Some that are done quite often are ungulate hunting by a very small percentage of the population. Tree felling for personal use is still quite diffused. Mushroom picking, some collection of wild herbs to eat, it's still performed. So these were the most three actually done in terms of frequency. And then we tried to understand, based on the ownership of pieces of knowledge, for example, knowledge of specific herbs that are disliked by farm animals or high quality timber areas, these kind of pieces of knowledge, how much they were owned by the population, by the community actually, and if they were or were not transmitted. So you can see in the green bars, these are pieces of knowledge that are owned and transmitted with against the percentage of the respondents that replied. And the blue bars are owned, but they are not transmitted. And one interesting thing that you can see is that, most pieces of knowledge that are owned are also transmitted. And that there were like 5 cases of pieces of knowledge that are still retained by at least half of the respondents. So, these were the case of, for example, the knowledge of at least 2-3 species, which seems very little, but in an urban context it's a lot. Knowledge of areas that are at risk of natural disasters. Historical natural disturbances that happen in the valley, so this kind of historical knowledge of the area. Local weather, so being able to understand where the winds come from, the precipitation pattern, etc., and specific uses for different tree species. Then we try to understand, with the quantitative work, we try to understand if there were some relations between, for example, the number of pieces of knowledge that one person has and the practice that they do, the number of practices that they still retain. And we found a positive correlation about this. More specifically, we understood that, for example, tree felling and hunting are two practices that are correlated with the highest number of pieces of knowledge that are retained by a person. And then we tried to understand if there were differences in the transmission level of people having different responsibilities in the community. So, sorry, again, the font is super small, but we classified 4 different types of roles that one could have in the community. So no role at all, so just being a passive member, let's say. Being a volunteer in some activities of the community, or being at least a bit active. Administration, so past roles in the administration level, and past roles or current roles in the leadership. And you can see, for example, the median that increases with different roles. So basically, the idea is that the most active you are, the more knowledge you retain, and possibly you transmit. Yes. Okay. So we try to also understand if there were differences in the destination of this knowledge transmission. So for each role, we try to understand if there were differences in transmission to family members, to community members, so to other regular members, or to other members of the larger community. For example, there are a lot of residents of the municipality where these regular are, that they are not members of the regular themselves. And usually there is a bit of antagonism between the different parts of the community because some have more rights on the same land, basically. So we wanted to understand a bit how the transmission works. And the idea is that, for example, well, family members are, as you could expect, the main beneficiaries of the transmission of the knowledge. So within the family, there is a lot of transmission. But, for example, with the people with past roles in the administration, they were also able to transmit to other members and to members outside the community. And this was even stronger in the leadership part. Okay, so some conclusions, some takeaway messages, let's say. Some of the surviving practices that are most done by the community are practices that are done also in the larger community, let's say. So people going to collect non-wood forest products. These are relatively common practices also beyond the community level. There were some interesting cases of knowledge that is not transmitted, or knowledge that is, or activities that are still highly performed. One is, for example, the transmission of herbs, the knowledge of herbs that are disliked by farm animals. And this didn't happen too much because basically there are no farms anymore in the area. So there is only one. And the second one was about tree felling for fuel wood. So basically each member of the regula has a right to collect a certain amount of trees for the production of his own fuel wood. So this is still fairly active because in an area where there is no gas coming in, and you have to rely on petrol or other sources, fuel wood is quite reliable and fairly cheap if you know how to do some tree felling, of course. So basically, we also understood that having responsibilities in the regular, so being actively involved, is very important for the transmission at community level. And the last part, I'll leave it to you maybe for some thoughts or comments also afterwards about some implications of this kind of work. We didn't manage to provide ourselves the results of this research to the community. We just provided a report and they shared it at their annual assembly, but they didn't allow us, let's say, to be present at the meeting to communicate these results. But maybe there are some hints for maybe some strategies to improve the transmission of this kind of knowledge and improve the conservation of this part of the knowledge. And yeah.